If everybody can come in, we're going to begin our second session. It's been a great day so far, and I know it's going to get better, so let's look forward to this next session, and then we'll enjoy some lunch together.
We'll go ahead and get ourselves settled, and while we're getting ourselves settled, a couple of cute stories to share with you. Remember that a merry heart does good like medicine. Don't lose your sense of humor, whatever you do. A little boy was waiting for his mother to come out of the grocery store. This was back when you could do that. You could leave your kid outside of the grocery store. As he waited, he was approached by this man who asked him, "Son, can you tell me where the post office is?" The little boy said, "Sure, I can tell you where the post office is. Just go straight down the street a couple of blocks and turn right." The man thanked the boy very kindly and said, "Hey, I'm the new preacher in town. I'd like to have you come to church on Sunday. I'll show you how to get to heaven." The little boy chuckled and said, "Ain't no way. You don't even know how to get to the post office. You can't tell me how to get to heaven." Oh. Now, in all audiences, I would not share this story, but I feel comfortable enough to share this with you. There was an elderly farmer in Florida. He had a large pond by his orchard. And one evening, he got a 5-gallon bucket to go out and pick some fruit in his orchard. And as he neared the pond, he heard these female voices. And he came closer, and he saw these young women skinny dipping in his pond. Aware of his presence, they were shocked and quickly swam to the deep end. "We're not coming out of here until you leave." The old man said, "I didn't come down here to see ladies swimming and skinny dipping in my pond. I came down here to feed my alligators." And the moral of that story is, old men think fast. Yeah. Oh, don't lose your sense of humor. I had a phone call driving from Johnson City to here this morning. And I just hate what this preacher friend of mine is going through with his adult daughter. And can you imagine someone saying this? She said, he said, "My daughter said to her mother, 'Will there ever be a day again in my life when I won't be sad?'" Man, that really cut me to the heart when I heard him relay that statement from his daughter. Man, life can be hard sometimes. I mean, really, really unbelievably, incredibly hard. Not everything that happens in this world is God's will. Now, I use that terminology in the sense of God's desire, not his permissive will. He does permit things to happen in this world that he doesn't want to happen. Do you think he wanted Eve to eat the forbidden fruit? Do you think he wanted the world to deteriorate the way it did to the point that he made that decision to have that cataclysmic worldwide flood? Not everything that happens in this world is God's will, God's desire. But in everything that happens, God has a will. Do you know what God's will always is? Whenever you are prospering greatly, and boy, life is wonderful, God's will is for you to glorify him and you to be a blessing to others. And when you are suffering your greatest adversity, and you wonder if you're going to have the strength to take one more breath, do you know what God's will is? That he be glorified and that you be a blessing to others. God's desire is always the same, whether we're talking about prosperity or adversity. Not everything that happens in this world is God's will. In other words, what God wants to happen. But in everything that happens, God does have a will. We can assign God's desire to everything we experience in this life. The awesome prosperity and the agony of our adversity. God needs to be glorified. And we need to be a blessing to others. And we can make sure that God's will is fulfilled. God's desire is fulfilled by our choice in how we act and react to the things that we experience in life. But boy, life can be tough. Meet Millie. I was preaching in a gospel meeting at the Groesbeck Church of Christ on the north side of Cincinnati, Ohio. And in that gospel meeting, the preacher, Mark Phillips, came to me and said, "Dean, I've got this 90-plus-year-old woman who wants to take you out on a date for lunch." And I said, "Sure, Mark." I said, "Whatever day is fine, and we'll go wherever she wants." Millie took me to a Japanese restaurant. I thought that was weird because I didn't think 90-plus-year-old women ate at Japanese restaurants. But Millie did, so that's where we ate that day. Oh, Millie, I am so thankful for that lunchtime with her. I call her my favorite widow. No offense to any of you who may be widowed. Whenever we ordered our meal and the waiter left, I said, "Millie, I love to do this with people." I said to her, "Millie, tell me your story." And she kind of was quizzical in how she looked at me. And I said, "Millie, your love and loss story. Tell me your story." So she tells me about this guy she was married to for 63 years. She told me about him as a husband and as a father. She told me about their life together. She told me about him getting cancer. She told me about her caregiving for him. She told me about him dying. And they had 63 years together. And it was a beautiful story. And then she drops this conversational bomb. She said, "But he wasn't my first husband." And I was shocked. I said, "Millie, tell me about your first husband." She said, "Well, I was 19 years old. And we already had one child, a little over a year old, and I was pregnant with our second child. And my husband was in General Patton's army in the Battle of the Bulge. And he died there." And I'll quote you exactly what she said after that. She said, "I had him buried in France, a decision that to this day I regret." His name was Ray Farmer. When I was at the Cold Harbor Church outside of Richmond, Virginia, there happened to be a guy there who heard that story. And he had this genealogical interest of his and had some access to some information that I would not. And he actually got me a picture of Ray Farmer's graveside marker in France. He was in General Patton's army and he died in the Battle of the Bulge. After she told me that story, I got to thinking a lot about that. And I thought, 19 years old, pregnant, already a child a little over a year old, in the mid-1940s. I couldn't help but wonder how in the world did she survive that? How in the world did she learn to cope with that? It was 4 years later that she married this man that she was married to for 63 years. So workshops after that, sometimes I would call her and I would say, "Millie, I want you to know I told your story." I wanted her to know that her life story had inspirational value. You know, it is often in the hardships and the difficulties that we experience, the storms that we weather, that we find great inspiration for ourselves and for others. You know, one of the things that kept me going in the earliest times after my wife passed away was thinking about the widowed people I knew. And I thought, if Marlene can do this, I can do this. If Frank is doing this, I can do this too. And I thought about so many widowed people who had proven to me by their inspirational life story, their life with their loss, that it can be done. I don't know how many of you saw a few years ago the movie I Can Only Imagine. It was a powerful faith-based story. This kid grew up in a highly dysfunctional family. The way he coped with that was he would find his exclusion or his distraction from all that dysfunction in writing songs and in playing his guitar. There came a point in time where his mother couldn't handle it anymore and she left. And so here he was with a father who was abusive and an alcoholic. When the boy graduated from high school, he left home too. Couldn't have happened early enough for him. He got a job setting up for this group that did concerts. And in the course of him setting up at this concert, he overheard the group talking about how that the lead singer didn't show up. Well, he had talent, he had experience. He said, I can sing for you, I can be the lead singer in this group. And so he started doing that. And they got a bus, one of those Partridge Family-like school buses, and they started traveling all over the country doing concerts. And they really weren't making it big. I mean, they were doing small venues. At a turning point in that movie, one of the entertainment agents got in his face after a concert and said, son, you're decent, but you're never going to be great until you take your pain and you turn it into your inspiration. He had a lot of pain in his life. And he took that pain and he turned it into inspiration. He went back home. He reconnected with his father over a period of time. It was difficult, but he reconnected with his father. And then he left home again. And they became the singing group Mercy Me and became a big hit. He took his pain and it became his inspiration. With the painful things that we've experienced in our life, those painful things can be our inspiration to build a new life, and can also be the inspiration other people need, because we need to see other people's success stories, other people's ability to navigate terrible, stormy times in their life. And we can be a great blessing to other people by learning to navigate the storm of loss in our life. I carry around with me everywhere I go, all over the country, 22 states now, the program for a little boy's memorial service in Pikeville, Kentucky. Andrew Allen, 7 years old. He just died. His daddy's the preacher at the Main Street Church in Pikeville, Kentucky. I carry that card in my planner everywhere I go that has a picture of Andrew. Awful loss to this day. Josh and April and their 2 daughters are struggling with Andrew's absence. Man, life can be hard. I mean, really hard. And great loss makes life really hard. We have to learn to live with it. That's a challenge that takes a lot of effort. What are the risk factors of being widowed? The first thing you have to do is get hitched. If you never get married, you're never at risk of being widowed, and you've got to stay married. Not everybody who gets hitched stays married, and if you're the one that keeps living, you're the one that's going to be widowed. Now I want to ask you to open this up. I'd like for us to think out loud together. I want you to name me at least 5 things that in our culture we commonly associate with widowhood. Name me 5 things. Somebody get me started. Name me 5 things that we would commonly associate with widowhood in our culture today. Go. Somebody get us started. Loneliness. Loneliness is almost always the first thing that's mentioned. What? Support?
Or lack thereof.
Moral support or lack thereof. Financial support or lack thereof. Give me something else. That's 2.
No direction.
No direction. There's a real sense of hopelessness that goes with a loss as significant as the loss of your wife or your husband. You just have no direction. You flounder. Yeah, you just flounder, kind of like a fish out of water that just flops around and is making no improvement. You're not going forward. Okay, 2 over here.
Also the will to live. Lack of the will to live.
Lack of will to live. There's a reason why the number 1 motto of the Widowhood Workshop Ministry is this: don't die until you're dead. Because when you have a husband or a wife die, you might feel dead. You might want to die. You might pray to God that He let you die. That may sound extreme to some of you, but to those who've been widowed, no, that's not irrational. That's not that uncommon. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, how do I go forward? What are the steps to, make my life worthy? And I've chosen the path of being kinder, seeking deeper friendships with people.
How do you go forward? How do you have a purposeful life? A life of meaning and value. And she mentioned about her choice to become more kind and loving and considerate of other people. Isn't it odd how that sometimes in great loss, whether it's great financial loss or loss of our health or the loss of some person in our life, that it's then that we start looking at life differently? Purposelessness is a problem in widowhood. Because really, what is my purpose now? What am I supposed to do with my life now? And that's a very common struggle. Who knew, though? I didn't know about that kind of stuff until it happened to me, and until I started reading about how other people were struggling with this kind of thing. Can you think of anything else that might be characteristic of widowhood, or we might commonly associate with widowhood? Yes, sir, and then over here. Anger is a very common problem. We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. It's a very common thing to be angry and have different objects of that anger. Over here, somebody. Yes, sir. Fault and blame. Yeah, because when something goes bad, somebody's to blame, right? I mean, that's a natural thing for us to think. That's the way we think as human beings. So, who did wrong? And sometimes your anger can be directed to yourself because you think you did something wrong. It's just a very, do you see how complicated this is? And do you see how deep-seated these issues are? This is not a superficial thing. We are naive and ignorant in regard to the powerful impact of loss and how it can really shake us. A certain kind of a loss can really shake us to the core of our being. And I mean cause us to think and feel things that are just so abnormal for us, uncharacteristic with our past. And it can cause us to be a kind of person that we even become concerned about ourselves. I wish I had $1. I wish I had $1 for every time somebody came to me and said, I thought I was going crazy. Now that sounds extreme, but that is very, very common. Probably one of the most common things to experience is that feeling. Now, let's think about a couple of things here. When we typically think about the loss of a spouse, we think about grieving and we think about shedding a lot of tears. Now, what do we say if we tear up in the presence of somebody else, or we break down and start crying in the presence of somebody else? What do we say? What do we have to apologize for? Absolutely nothing. One of the best books I ever read early on was a book written by Doug Manning. It's called Don't Take My Grief Away. It's out there on the display table. The table that you're not supposed to steal the preacher's books from? That table. Don't Take My Grief Away, Doug Manning. Boy, he is so right. Sometimes we feel like we need to apologize for shedding tears. Why do we feel that way? That has kind of become a classical, contemporary cultural response. And those kind of responses are typically not good, and they're typically not correct, and often not healthy. Don't just say something because that's what you've heard other people say. It's okay to tear up and cry and not be able to control your emotions. Do you know that there are two hard places, really hard places, for widowed people to go after they've lost their spouse? One of them is to bed, because that is an in-your-face reminder. You are alone. That is a brutal, brutal reminder. And the second place is right here in this room. Going back to church after you've lost your spouse is very hard. Where do you sit? And then there are those songs. I've jokingly said song leaders need to send a list of the songs they're going to sing to all the widowed people in their church before they pick out the songs for Sunday. Obviously, they couldn't do that. But sometimes it's songs. Sometimes it's things that are said in a public prayer. I really miss sitting beside my wife and holding her hand when we're led in prayer publicly in our church family. I miss that. There is nobody there to put your arm around. It is brutal coming to church. Now, see, that just doesn't seem consistent with how most people would normally think, because going to church is positive. It's something that we ought to do, something we need to do, and it's a place of worship and praise and fellowship and encouragement. It is also one of the most challenging places for people to go. And why in the world? Now, I cut everybody slack on this, but why in the world in the church do we let widowed people sit alone? That never dawned on me until it happened to me. In Mission, Texas, when I was down there, that's way down there at the tip of Texas, there was a young couple who came in on Sunday morning, and they told me that they have a personal ministry that they'd come up with. This was way before I came there and did a workshop. This young couple, they come in, and what they do is they scope out the people who are there. And they're in search of a widowed person. And they go up to a widowed person and they say, "May we sit with you today?" Isn't that an awesome ministry? This young married couple, they do that. Wouldn't that be a great ministry for somebody? Yes, sir.
Finally hit something that's really been me. My wife passed away 18 years ago. And if it hadn't been for my church family here, and my sisters and daughters, I don't know what, I very seldom ever come depressed. But all of the help from them kept me from being depressed. I was lonely, but not depressed.
18 years of living with loss, and the church family can be a great help, but a lot of times the church family isn't, because they don't understand what the people need. The typical widowed person who loses their spouse loses 75% of their social network. They don't know what to do with you. And out of concern, they stay away from you because they're afraid of doing something wrong, which leads to feelings of neglect because they are being neglected, which creates more hurt. There was a woman in West Tennessee, her name is Cindy. She told me about after her husband passed away. She hated how her children avoided ever mentioning about their daddy. That's the very thing that she wanted them to talk about. What she wanted to hear about was she wanted to hear about her husband, their father, but they wouldn't bring the subject up because they didn't want to hurt their mother. You see what a mess we are? Even in our families, in our nuclear families, and in our church families sometimes. We're not the support that we could be and should be, and a lot of it is because of illiteracy. Grief illiteracy. H. Norman Wright, who is he's passed on now, but he was a counselor, a faith-based counselor kind of fella. He made the observation one time in one of his books that we live in a grief-illiterate society. And he said, in a grief-illiterate society, it's very hard to grieve effectively because of that illiteracy. We don't know about grief. We don't know about the effect of loss. And so we make many mistakes, and we often are neglectful of people who are struggling with great loss in their life. Now, what about the possibility of losing a spouse and you feel more relief than you feel grief? Can you imagine any scenario where that might be the case? Where somebody loses their spouse and they actually feel relief? Yeah, what about a person who's been terminally ill? They're a child of God, they're a Christian, but they've suffered for a good while, and they pass on. You've been a caregiver. Well, tomorrow morning I'll mention a little bit about being a caregiver. That was the hardest thing I ever did. I was exhausted all the time. I morphed into a person I never wanted to become. To this day, I have regretful memories of that time in my life. When that person dies, your caregiving is over. If they're a child of God, they're in a better place. Now, you have to deal with their absence, but they're in a better place. There can be a sense of relief. Well, if you're supposed to feel grief when your spouse passes away, but you feel more relief than you do grief, how's that going to make you feel? You're going to be guilty, just like you felt guilty when you started tearing up and couldn't speak to another person because you got emotional and you started crying at church. See what a mess we are? Now, and then there are people, do you know there are people who can't cry? Physiologically, atomically, they cannot cry. There are people like that. What if you've lost somebody very precious in your life, but you don't cry? See how conflicted we can be internally with these things? The heartache that you have when you've lost your spouse is incredible. And you're probably going to start having some questions. It's not an unusual thing to have a boatload of questions start surfacing in your mind. Questions that you have never asked before. You've never thought about these things before. But you've never experienced this before, so we need to cut ourselves some slack here. And some of these questions may have to do with God, with your church family, with yourself, and your own personal faith. It is not an uncommon thing. It is nothing to be ashamed of if you have a faith struggle. Nothing to be ashamed of. As a matter of fact, do you know you can take that faith struggle and turn it into a blessing? What we may seem to view initially as a burden can actually be turned into a blessing. You take that faith struggle and you address it in the right way, you're going to become stronger and wiser and have very special experience like you never had before. You can actually take that burden and turn it into a blessing. But you got to get your game face on. You've got to attack that faith struggle. You've got to address the faith struggle. We need to let other people know. Do you know why a lot of people lose their faith? Long before they got to the point where they lost their faith, they were in the process of losing their faith and didn't let anybody else know. There wasn't a brother or sister in the Lord. There wasn't any shepherd in their local church that knew they were struggling with their faith. Tomorrow morning, typically in our worship service, we offer a public invitation and we invite people to come and share any prayer concern they have. I don't see that as much nowadays as I used to when I first started going to church. And how many of us would be willing to admit publicly to our church family that we're a mess and we need help? See, we don't like for other people to know that we need help. And then because of that, people are starving because they're being deprived of the support and help and encouragement that they need. It's okay to let other people know you are not okay, because you know what? When you let other people know that you're not okay, you're probably letting somebody know that's also not been okay in their life. They're probably going to be able to relate to some degree to what you're going through. Do you know what we have when we got a bunch of people at church on Sunday morning? You know the biggest crowd that we have? We have what I call a mass of a mess, because we're a mess. We have problems. We have issues. It's okay to let other people know. We're in need. There's a song, by the way, that says, people need people. I encourage you to go to YouTube and search for that song. People need people. The lyrics are powerful. The loneliness is incredibly unique. In Middle Tennessee, there is a sister in the Lord who said, the loneliness is suffocating. That sounds like pretty bad loneliness. Her husband was a preacher, by the way. Many of you remember Kathy Lee Gifford. You probably still see commercials of her on TV. Frank Gifford. When I was a kid, I'm so old. Now, some of you guys are old geezers too, and you remember watching black and white TV, NFL, Frank Gifford, halfback for the New York Giants. Well, she was married to Frank Gifford. They were married for 29 years. Now, they both had been married previously. Now, they were married for 29 years, though, in this second marriage, and he was significantly older than she was. One of the things I loved about her was when he passed away, she was very transparent about her struggle. Now, I know that you probably wonder why in the world I would ever pick up an AARP magazine, but I did one time do this, and there happened to be an article in there. It was like an interview, and it was a little bit of the telling of the story of Kathy Lee Gifford. She said in regard to her loneliness, she said it was crippling loneliness. That sister said, remember, suffocating. Kathy Lee Gifford said, crippling loneliness. She was asked about why in the world she moved from New York City to Williamson County, to Franklin, Tennessee. And here's what she said, quote, I moved here because I was dying of loneliness. See, that loneliness, this is a different kind of loneliness. You've lived with that person in a way that you've not lived with anybody else. And do you know that there are over 8 billion people on planet Earth? How many people are in your marriage? Only you and that one other person. If that doesn't help you appreciate how unique and how special, how worth treasuring your marriage is, I don't know what would. And you lose that one person, it's going to be a blow that's going to create a real challenge in regard to your loneliness. You were somebody's spouse, somebody's husband, somebody's wife. And sometimes in life, we let some circumstance in our life become a part of, or entirely, our identity. I'm a cancer patient. I'm a preacher. I'm a nurse. I'm a teacher. I'm a senior citizen. None of those things should identify us. I've got good news for you. You are not your age. Also, you are not your health condition. You are a creature that exists in the image of God and after His likeness. That's who you are. That's your personal identity. And that's the personal identity of everybody who lives in your neighborhood. And even the people who are homeless. Human beings exist in the image of God and after His likeness. If you're a Christian, you're redeemed by the blood of Jesus, and you are a child of God. That is your identity. These things that are temporary in this world, they're not your identity. I am a widower, but a widower is not who I am. There is an identity crisis. You're going to struggle with who you are. It's going to take a while to sort that out. There can be financial jeopardy. 3 to 4 times. That's the statistic. U.S. Census Bureau has done studies about this. Widowed females, elderly widowed females. Now, they didn't define what the word elderly meant to them. I don't know where that starts. Elderly women who are widowed are 3 to 4 times more likely to live in poverty than elderly women who are married. 3 to 4 times more likely to live in poverty. If you think that we have created the perfect social net for widowed folks, it's called Social Security. You need to go to school, the school of Social Security. It can even be a trap. It can create conflict and challenges after loss that you never dreamed that you'd ever experience. It's not the perfect safety net. It's a helpful program, but it's not the be-all, end-all. You're having to deal with forced change, and nobody likes to be forced to change. And you're having to deal with the absence of the person. When you look at the chair where they sat, what do you see? Nothing. Air. That is a brutal reality. You know that little 7-year-old boy? I visited in their home in Pikeville, Kentucky. I was doing a grief workshop there in December, just this past December. And that little boy's room, Andrew, 7 years old, it's just like it used to be. They're still having to grapple with his absence. Having to deal with the absence of that person that meant so much to you is heart-wrenching. It's not uncommon to have dreams years and years and years after you've lost your spouse. Not uncommon at all. You're not going crazy. That part of your life was very significant. Do you have trouble, are you like me, do you have trouble controlling your brain when you're awake? When you're asleep, how much control do you have over your brain? It's going to go wherever it wants to go. It's not an uncommon thing. That person meant a lot to you. It's okay to dream about that person. You can't stop that. You're having now to deal with silence. Now, when you're living with somebody, occasionally things like this are said. What in blue blazes are you doing? Can't you be quieter? Oh, come on now. I'm talking on the phone. I need some silence. Well, a widowed person doesn't have that problem. As a matter of fact, that is a problem. The silence. The deafening. I call it the deafening silence. As a matter of fact, what do you think most widowed people do first thing in the morning? Not all, but what do you think most widowed people do in the morning when they get up? You look at the pillow laying right next to you and you see absence. You turn on the radio or the TV. The silence is a real struggle. The emptiness that you feel is very natural and very normal because that person helped to fill up your life. And you now have a dependence that you don't want, that you haven't experienced in the past, but you have to embrace. How do you feel when you help other people? You feel good, don't you? When people want to help us, but we deny them that opportunity, what have we deprived them of? The joy that we've experienced in helping other people. And let me suggest to you, in ministering to others, don't ask somebody, what can I do for you? You know, somebody who's hurting, who's struggling, who's dealing with a difficult time in their life, don't ask them what you can do for them. I was sitting in the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, with Marlon Troyer, and his wife was being treated for cancer. He made this remark while we were sitting in the snack bar. He said, Dean, I wish people would stop asking me, what can I do for you? I wish people would just look at what needs to be done and do it and not even ask me. Have you ever thought about the extra burden that we lay on people whenever we ask them? Now, they're already hurting and struggling, but we're going to ask them, okay, you tell me what I should do for you. We've given them another assignment. Don't do that. Find out what they need. Use your eyes. Use your ears. You know other people who know them. Do your research. Do your homework. Find out what people need who are going through something like this, and then just go ahead and do it. Be like the guy who went to his friend's house, knocked on the door, and said, hey, brother, I don't know what you do in regard to your landscaping, but you're not doing anything with it from now on. I'm taking that over. He just went in there and he took over the landscaping at that guy's house. That guy was burdened enough, and he knew that guy was burdened. He knew he could take that job over. He could lighten that person's burden, so that's what he did. Sometimes it's not good to ask for permission. It's better just to go ahead and do something. When I was visiting with Marlene McCoyne up in Hartville, Ohio, every time I go back there, I always make it a point of visiting with widowed people. I can't visit with all of them that I dearly love, but I do make it a point to visit with some. I went and visited with Marlene. We had a great visit together. Toward the end of the visit, I found out that she had a light that wasn't coming on when she flipped the switch. So I got up and I said, "Hey, Marlene, before I leave, I want to check your light." And she said, "Oh, don't worry about it, Dean." You know, she didn't want to be a bother. And I said, "No, Marlene, I want to look at this light before I leave." And she said, "No, don't bother with it, Dean." I said, "Marlene, if you don't let me look at this light, I'm going to move in with you." She said, "There's the stool." Do you know what she needed? She just needed a light bulb replaced. Sometimes we have to realize that we're in a phase in our life or a set of circumstances where we need to not only permit people to help us, but we need to even be willing to ask for help. It's okay to ask for help. Don't let yourself become independent to a fault. The stress level is incredible because you've never been through this, and it's not an uncommon thing to be mad. I'm talking about mad. I mean really mad. Who are we going to be mad at, by the way? Let's make a list of people we can be mad at. Who can get us started?
Yourself.
Okay, I'm going to be mad at myself. Okay? Why am I going to be mad at myself? I can't bring this person back to life. They've died. They're gone. But I'm going to be mad at myself.
Because I didn't do more.
Because I didn't do more? I couldn't stop the process? Or maybe I misbehaved during my caregiving time? We can be angry at ourselves. And sometimes we can make mistakes that can contribute to people's passing. That'd be a hard thing to deal with, anger toward yourself. Who else might you be angry at? Yes, ma'am. The medical community. They do not know everything. Nobody knows everything about anything, period. Let's get humble here. Let's get real. Nobody knows everything about anything. That's including the medical profession. They know a lot of stuff. They have experience, and that's great. But every human body is different. What they do to help one human body may not help another human body. As a matter of fact, it may be hurtful, even deadly to another person. The medical profession is not perfect. It's a beautiful blessing from God, but it's not perfect. They make mistakes. We can be angry at the medical profession. We can be angry at ourselves, angry at the medical profession. Who else are we going to be angry at? The church. Angry at, and the church is going to be neglectful. There's going to be a part of your church family that's going to be neglectful. Hopefully not because they don't care, but because they don't know. They don't understand. Yes, ma'am. Somebody over here?
You can be mad at them for dying.
Mad at them for... Now, how crazy is this? The person has died, they're gone, you can't bring them back, and you're mad at them. Do you know that that's not that uncommon? I met a lady down in Florida who admitted to me that after her husband died, there were times that she would go nuclear or postal, or she would go extreme. When she was taking a shower sometimes, she would beat the shower wall and she'd say, "Why did you leave me? Why did you leave me?" She was expressing anger toward her husband because her husband had the goal to leave her. Now that may sound crazy to some people. That's not so crazy. Anger toward the person who's passed on is not that uncommon. It could be that that person, they did make a mistake of some sort that led to their death. Would we be willing to admit that maybe a person might even be tempted to be mad at God? God did let that happen. Everything that happens in this world is permitted by God. He lets it happen. He let my wife be diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in her early 50s. He let her swiftly decline for a Parkinson's patient, swiftly decline for 8.5 years. He let her die on Christmas morning. Couldn't he have picked a different time? Christmas morning, come on. You know, what we have to understand and appreciate is the fact that we live in a broken world. But it's also the perfect world to choose actions and reactions that glorify God and are a blessing to others. God does let things happen. That doesn't mean he wants them to happen. You know, sometimes as a parent, as our children are growing up, we let things happen, hoping that them experiencing what we knew was going to happen, that we let happen, hopefully they learn from that. God does the same thing with us. He lets things happen. But he has that consistent desire for him to be glorified and for us to be a blessing to others. Yes. If you're angry with somebody, what should you do? What's the best way to handle that? To stuff it, you know, like air in a balloon. You put too much air in a balloon, what's going to happen to the balloon? It's going to blow up. How about going to God with that anger? That's where you need to go when you're angry with God, is you need to go to God. And you need to talk to God about that anger. Prayer is not just powerful. It's also therapeutic. The worry and the fears that you have are very natural and very normal because you've never flied solo. See, you're flying solo now in a coupled world. And you are what one author called involuntarily single. Involuntarily single. That's a nice way of saying you're widowed. You've been forced to deal with the loss of your marriage. The restlessness that you have, the tossing and turning, because of a lot of the questions and emotions and thoughts you have, are going to be a struggle. Now, in Chester, West Virginia, there was a guy who came to me when this list was about half of what this list has been today. He came to me and he said, "Brother, I've got another thing I'd like to add to that list." And here's what he added. He was a guy probably in his early 80s, and he was tearing up when he shared this with me. Said suicidal thoughts. With his suggestion, I added it to the list. You know, there are a lot more suicidal thoughts than there are suicides. And again, don't be naive. Tomorrow morning, maybe even this morning, don't be naive that there aren't people who the last few days have had suicidal thoughts. Whenever we struggle with these kinds of issues, it's so important for us to share them with the appropriate people to get the kind of help that we need. Don't think that you have to go through the difficult struggle that you are or the loss that you're having to live with alone, because you don't. You can make a choice to live with your loss with the help of God and the help of his family. Why in the world is this so difficult? Well, it's difficult because it's a unique relationship. It is the only relationship in the Bible described with that two-word phrase, one flesh. What's happened to that one flesh relationship? That one flesh has been torn apart. Death has forced the tearing apart of that one flesh. Imagine if something were to happen to you, that a part of your physical body was literally ripped off without anesthetic. How painful would that be? It's a very unique relationship. And if you do it right, and there's only one way to do it right, here's your prescription for a magnificent marriage. Nobody has a perfect marriage. Nobody is married to a perfect person. But everybody can have a magnificent marriage if they choose to embrace this philosophy, the total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. That's a beautiful marriage. That's a magnificent marriage. And when you have that kind of a marriage and you lose that kind of a marriage, you're going to be a train wreck because you're human. Again, you're not a machine, nor are you a robot. We need to appreciate the fact that we're just mere mortal human beings struggling with great loss. And don't ever say to anybody, especially to a widowed person, don't ever say the most insulting thing you can say, I know how you feel. You ought to be slapped upside the head if you were to say something like that. Have you ever thought about how stupid that is to say that? But yet, remember I said yesterday, Google it, dumb things caring people say. Caring people, just like you and me, we can say dumb things. In our illiteracy, in our grief illiteracy, we can say dumb things, though we have a caring heart. Don't ever say to somebody, I know how you feel. You can't. There's just no way. You can't. You're not living in their skin. You haven't had their life history. You haven't been a part of their relationship. You don't have their personality. You cannot know how somebody else feels unless they tell you honestly, transparently, how they feel. You know, people are individuals, relationships are different, families are different. Some families are very private. Some families don't talk much at all. They're not very open. Some families are very dysfunctional. People can be married a very short period of time. Do you know that there are people who are married a very short period of time and they lose their spouse? Think about how different that would be from living 63 years with somebody and losing your spouse. I have a friend who now lives in Texas. A lady who, I don't know for sure how old she is, maybe late 40s. She's never going to hear me estimate her age, so I'm safe. She was married to a preacher for a number of years, and he died. I think, if I remember correctly, they knew one another for over 25 years, counting the time they dated and married. And he, as a preacher, up and died on her. She got married again to another preacher, and he died 5 months later. 5 months. Do you know there are people who have only been married a few months? Many more people than you could imagine. People that I know who've only been married a few short years or even just a few months. People are different, experiences are different, and amount of faith would make a difference too. At some point in time in our grief journey, and I'd like to have, Todd, would you come up here and help me with this? Sometime on your grief journey, after you've lost your spouse, what you need to realize is that you've come to a fork in the road. I'm going to give you a fork if you're widowed. Now again, we don't give trophies to everybody, only if you're widowed. If you're widowed, I want you, as Todd makes his way around the auditorium, I want Todd to give you one of these forks. Now, let me explain to you what I'm giving you the forks for. You go ahead and raise your hand as he moves around. I want every widowed person to take a fork home. Now, if you want to lose weight, you can use it to eat with. Okay? It's pretty small. It might help you lose weight, but that's not the reason I'm giving it to you. Here's what I want to ask you to do. I want you to take this fork home and I want you to put it somewhere where you will see it every single day. Every day. Now, when you pick up a fork, what have you decided to do? Eat, okay? What else are you deciding with that fork in hand? You have decided to eat, so you pick up your fork. What else are you deciding? What you're going to eat. Was your mother like my mother? She would talk about these starving kids in China. And you need to eat everything. You shouldn't choose. You should eat everything on your plate. Well, you're an adult. You don't have to, okay? You don't have to eat everything. But you're deciding what you're going to eat. Now, what else are you deciding? How much you're going to eat. When you're going to quit eating, The point I'm trying to make is with this fork in your hand, you are making decisions. Whenever you have lost a precious person in your life, especially when that person is your marital mate, your number one assignment is to grieve. Don't let anybody take your grief away. You grieve in the way you need to, for as long as you need to, and don't let anybody stop you from grieving. Again, the book, Doug Manning, Don't Take My Grief Away. We need to realize that when we've suffered great loss, we have to grieve. We're going to grieve. We're either going to grieve when it happens, or we're going to grieve down the road because something else happens. We're going to have a come to Jesus time where we're going to grieve. The best time to grieve is when it happens. We need to focus our attention on our loss, how we're thinking and how we're feeling. And it's all about one thing, and it's not coping. It's just surviving. I'm not talking about day-to-day survival. I'm talking about hour-to-hour survival. That person I talked to on the phone driving down here from Johnson City, one of the things that I suggested to him is I said, hey, you, your wife, your daughter, don't think about this as day-to-day. I said, think about this hour to hour. This is a hard time in your life. It's like sitting in front of a slammed shut, locked door. In our life, we have doors that are opened and we have doors that are closed. This door has been slammed shut. It's not been closed, it's been slammed shut. And not only has it been slammed shut by death, it's also been locked. And it doesn't matter how long you touch that knob, you can't open that door. That has ended. It may not have ended in your heart, but it's ended in reality, and that's a brutal concept to wrap your feeler around, that the end has come. You're not that person's husband anymore. You're not that person's wife anymore. Your marriage has ended. You may still feel married, but you are not married. That is brutal. That is really hard to deal with. If your marriage meant anything to you, if that person meant the world to you, that is a really hard thing to deal with in life. So what we need to do early on is we need to focus all our attention on our grieving. But at some point in time, we've got to realize that, okay, we've come to a fork in the road. Now, I could have pictured for you another kind of fork in the road, but I'm hoping that this one that you see on the screen is one that will be emblazoned in your memory. What am I going to do now with my life? See, that's the decision you've got to make in your life. You are not dead. Your spouse died. Don't die until you're dead. Just choosing to exist after your spouse dies is not glorifying God. Choose to live. But you can't do that until you grieve effectively to help yourself begin to get to a better place. What am I going to do with the rest of my life? Many of us know the story of Helen Keller, and boy, what an inspiration she is. When one door of happiness closes, she wrote, another opens, but often we look so long at the closed door, we do not see the one that has been opened for us. I prayed a lot, passionately, for three things after my wife died. Lord, open a door of opportunity for me so I can still serve you. I can still be a minister. I'd resigned from the pulpit of a church I dearly loved because I needed to care for my wife. And I knew if I tried to push myself back in that pulpit, I could have split that church. I knew I needed to fold my tent and go away. Lord, open a door of opportunity for me. I still want to serve you. Number two, Lord, give me the vision to see the open door when you open it. Sometimes God opens doors, but we don't see them. We don't see them because we're distracted or maybe we're busy. We need to look for open doors in our life. I asked the Lord to give me the vision to see the open door. Thirdly, I prayed, Lord, give me the courage to walk through that open door. A door that I'd never passed through before. Because all of my children and my grandchildren were in the southeast part of the country, and I'm a born and bred Buckeye, lived in Ohio the vast majority of my life. I knew I needed to move in the southeast part of the country. I told my daughters before they left home in January of 2014, after my wife passed away, I said, girls, this is going to be really hard to make this move. I said, number one, I'm 61 years old. Churches don't want 61-year-old preachers. Strike one. I said, strike two, I'm a widower. I don't have a wife. Churches want twofers, two for the price of one. Strike two. I said, I'm a Yankee. I don't even talk with their accent. Strike three. I said, girls, this is going to be really hard. It was harder even than I thought. I knew it was going to be hard. Do you know where the Lord opened a door? A little place in West Tennessee called Murray City, Tennessee. M-A-U-R-Y. Not Mari, it's pronounced Murray City by the locals. Population 650. Every time I say that, I think about Hee Haw. Remember that segment of Hee Haw? Murray City, Tennessee, population 650. Salute! The population of the county was 14,600. That little church was a broken-hearted church. They had had a fuss, a mega fuss. They were no longer the church that they used to be. And I was a broken-hearted preacher. They let me come and be their preacher. They let me start a local widowhood ministry there. A widowhood ministry that began with me and about 4 widowed females. And we started inviting widowed people of any age, either gender, no matter what their religious background was, or even if they were an atheist, we invited them to come and have a meal with us. We called them widowhood fellowships. Grew to over a dozen, grew to over 20, grew to over 30, grew to over 40, consistently, sometimes over 50. They would come from sometimes 4 different counties. And half of them, and sometimes over half of them, were not members of the church. And people were introduced to Jesus and his church through that compassionate ministry. I chose not to waste my pain. Whenever we've been through a painful time in our life, we don't need to be wasting it. We need to use it for the glory of God by using it to help other people. Who's probably the best person to help a cancer patient with the experience of treatments and surgeries? Somebody who's been there and done that. What about a person who's gone through financial disaster, maybe has lost a business they've invested their life in? Somebody else who's had the same painful experience. How about a person who struggled with a divorce they never wanted, but their spouse blew it up? How about another person who's been through that experience? Who can often best help a widowed person? Another widowed person. That's a great ministry for widowed people. God can use you in a special way to help other people in ways that other people could not possibly help them. Don't waste your pain. The choices that we have to make after we've suffered great loss, like the loss of our spouse, we've got to decide, what am I going to do? See, God didn't save us just to come and warm a pew once in a while at the church building, or even every Sunday. God saved us to serve. The third book I wrote is called After the End Comes. I've written 3 books about widowhood: Before the End Comes, When the End Comes, and After the End Comes. All 3 of them are out there on that ministry table in the foyer. That third book, After the End Comes, has a chapter in it about ministry after loss. A lot of times, as Christians in the Lord's church, we share in ministry with our spouse. But when our spouse is gone, we wonder where we fit in the ministry of the church. We need to make sure we find a place to serve in the Lord's church, even though we've lost our spouse. What are we going to do? Well, we're released or free. Whether or not we choose to marry or not marry, that's up to us. but we are released or free. Now, the conflicting thing is, in your heart, you may not feel that way. You may not feel that way for years. But the reality is, you're no longer married. Now, as a person who's no longer married, you do not have the responsibilities that go with marriage, which are numerous. What are you going to do with all that time and effort? You know, the total giving of the total self for a total lifetime. You invested real heavily in your marriage. Now that marriage is no longer in existence, what are you going to do with all the time and effort that you have invested? A really great place to invest your life is in your relationship with the Lord, especially after loss. My spiritual life changed significantly after my wife passed away. My prayer life was very different than previously. I remember for months it was hard for me to even thank the Lord for that wife I had for 41 years. I would get choked up and emotional and couldn't say the words. And I was so thankful at that point that God could read my heart. When bad things happen, one thing that we should realize, maybe more clearly than we've ever realized before, is we need the Lord. One of the great blessings that comes from great pain and severe loss is the realization that we need the Lord. We don't always feel like that. Would we be willing to admit that? We don't always feel like that whenever we're prospering. But when we're struggling, we're more likely to feel that way. We're more available, we're more flexible, and we have experience. Granted, we didn't want the experience, but we're stuck with it. And with that availability and flexibility and that experience, what a blessing we can be to the Lord. See, widowhood is not just a time of grief. It's a time of transition. It's a time of adjustment. It's also a time of opportunity, and we need to decide what we're going to do. And what is our new normal going to be? What is our new beginning going to be? That's what we need to work toward after we've lost our spouse. Well, it's going to be whatever you choose to make it to be. But that's a hard thing to decide about. And it takes time to figure that out. We need to be patient with ourselves. I conclude with several things shared with me by others, just to make sure you don't leave this room without feeling the feeling and thinking the thoughts. 8 years ago, I married my best friend. 8 years ago, I never imagined my life would be the way it is now. I never dreamed until death do us part, that part of our vows would become my reality so soon. When I lost my husband, Roy, it was as if I entered into another universe. I wasn't only grief-stricken, I was disoriented, terrified, completely at a loss as to what I was supposed to do next. Although I wasn't on any medication, I felt like I was in a coma. I could hear what was going on. My body was present, but my mind was elsewhere. I don't know what's going on, he said. This afternoon, I'm just so lonesome. But when people are around, I just want them to leave so I can cry. A widow in Arkansas said I wasn't a person anymore. Couples turned their backs on me. A lady in Florida who lost her spouse in her 50s texted me on April 14th of 2020 and permits me to share this with you. I was told by a family member that loves me that time will heal. I don't think that is at all possible. 33 years of my life with my husband, sharing 3 children together, was my whole world. I can't see past today, and the pain is too much. We did everything together, she said, up in Ohio. We were married for 48 and a half years when a tiny germ, she calls it, COVID, took his life. I'm struggling with extreme loneliness. The house is so quiet and no longer alive with joy. One preacher, teacher friend of mine in Middle Tennessee said, on August 16th of 2020, my heart was shattered by my wife going home to be with the Lord. Now I live in a time that I do not understand. It's a lonely world of darkness I no longer fit into. I have no one to care for but myself. The one I devoted myself to is gone. He later said in this email, frankly, my life stopped that day. This is not the way we planned it. My whole life was gone. She was not supposed to die before me. We held hands constantly for 55 years. We thoroughly discussed everything we did. She laid out my clothes every morning so we would match every day. I eat out very little, he said later. Sunday was our day to eat out. Someone at church will ask me to join them, and I accept once in a while. I always go when the church has an eating event, but who do I sit with? If I sit with a family, their conversation does not allow me to join in. This is because I don't really fit in. The space inside of me, previously occupied by that passionate relationship, was strangely empty. I went from having somebody think I was the most amazing person on earth to feeling invisible and vacant. And one nurse admitted this: I wanted to kill myself. Going to bed alone at night was so hard. I prayed that God would let me die. I wanted out of this life. One retired preacher that I love and appreciate dearly, Brother Bill Goodpasture, posted this on Facebook, and I end with this one. A real marriage is about sharing, and the widow or widower no longer has someone to unload their life with. Children are great, friends are fine, but never the same as what a husband and wife share. Dear Janice, wish you were here, but glad you are there. I hope you appreciate a little bit more what a struggle it can be. I had no idea that people in my church family that I love dearly were struggling like this. But I know now. I want others to know, because we could sure be a lot better help than we have been in the past. Lord, forgive us of our neglect. Help us to do a whole lot better now. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this time to be together this morning. Thank you, Father, for this church that compassionately opened her doors to permit an opportunity to grow in knowledge about the powerful impact of loss, what it can do to us, and what it's like, so that we can learn to be better, more effective servants of others. Thank you for this church. Thank you, Father, for every person who's come, despite the fact this was not a popular subject. Thank you for their willingness to be exposed to things that can be very thought-provoking and even heart-touching. Father, help us to have hearts of compassion, and help us to also be willing to be transparent so that we can have better closeness with other people. Father, help us to develop the kind of fellowship in your church that we will actually be willing to share our struggles with others so that we can help one another better like you want us to. Help us, Father, to be your hands, your huggers, your comforters, your lovers, your encouragers, so that we can reflect your compassion and your love for hurting people. Father, please be with us as we go about life and interact with others. Help us to be careful, to be observant, and to look for opportunities to be a blessing to others. It's in the name of your Son. We also thank you for the food that we're about to eat, for the people who helped to plan it and provide this meal. Thank you, Father. In Jesus' name. Amen.